What if the one thing you believed made you worthless was exactly what someone else needed most? If you've ever felt broken by circumstances beyond your control, if you've ever been told you weren't enough because of what you couldn't give, this story will touch your very soul. Watch until the end, because what unfolds will show you that sometimes our deepest wounds become the foundation for our greatest blessings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The locomotive's whistle cut through the crisp October morning as it approached Cedar Falls, Wyoming territory. Inside the passenger car, 26-year-old Catherine Elizabeth Walsh pressed her gloved hand against the cool window, watching the endless prairie give way to rolling hills dotted with cattle ranches. Her reflection stared back, auburn hair pinned beneath a modest traveling hat, green eyes that had once sparkled with hope now shadowed with resignation, and a face that still bore traces of the beauty that had once made men turn their heads in Boston drawing rooms. But beauty, Catherine had learned, meant nothing when you couldn't fulfill a woman's most fundamental purpose. The letter in her reticule, worn soft from countless readings, had been her lifeline for the past 4 months. Robert Harrison, cattle rancher of Cedar Falls, had responded to her carefully worded advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper with such earnest sincerity that she'd almost believed in second chances again. His letters spoke of wide open spaces, honest work, and a desire for companionship after 2 years of widowhood. What she hadn't mentioned, what she couldn't bear to write, was the reason she'd placed that advertisement in the first place. The train lurched as it began its final approach to Cedar Falls. Catherine gathered her belongings, one trunk containing her few remaining possessions and a carpet bag with her most precious keepsakes, her mother's pearl earrings, her father's Bible, and tucked deep beneath everything else, the medical certificate from Dr. Thornfield that had shattered her previous life into irreparable pieces. Irreversible damage to the reproductive organs, the physician had pronounced, with clinical detachment after her bout with scarlet fever 3 years prior. Marriage and motherhood are no longer possibilities, Miss Walsh. You must adjust your expectations accordingly. Those words had ended her engagement to Marcus Pemberton, son of one of Boston's most prominent banking families. The man who had proclaimed his undying love had taken exactly 1 day to consider the doctor's diagnosis before calling off their wedding. "A man needs heirs, Catherine," he'd explained with the cold practicality that she now realized had always lurked beneath his romantic declarations. Surely you understand. Her family had understood too. Her father, a respected minister, had spoken in hushed tones about God's mysterious ways, while her mother had retreated into social obligations that somehow never included her eldest daughter anymore. Even her younger sister Margaret had begun, treating her with a mixture of pity and relief. Pity for Catherine's circumstances, relief that she herself remained whole and marriageable. The final blow had come when her parents decided to move to California, accepting a missionary position that would take them far from the whispered gossip of Boston society. They'd spoken of new beginnings and fresh starts, but the invitation had been extended to everyone except Catherine. "Perhaps it's best if you make your own way, dear," her mother had said, unable to meet her eyes. "A fresh start somewhere, one knows your situation." So Catherine had done exactly that. She'd sold what few valuable possessions she owned, placed her advertisement, and corresponded with Robert Harrison for 4 months, carefully crafting letters that painted her as a woman seeking companionship and partnership rather than the traditional wife and mother he undoubtedly expected. Now, as the train shuddered to a stop at Cedar Falls' modest station, Catherine's carefully constructed optimism began to crumble. Through the window, She could see a man standing on the platform, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair beginning to grey at the temples, and a face weathered by sun and wind. Even from a distance she could see the honest strength in his posture. The way he scanned each passenger car with patient attention, this had to be Robert Harrison, and in mere moments she would have to face him with the truth that would undoubtedly send her back on the next eastbound train. Catherine forced herself to stand, smoothing her travelling dress, a deep green wool that had once been her finest, but now showed the subtle signs of careful mending. She'd chosen it specifically because it complemented her eyes, one of the few vanities she still allowed herself. If she was to be rejected again, at least she would face it looking her best. The platform was busier than she'd expected for such a small town. Ranchers in dusty coats mingled with townspeople collecting mail and packages, while children darted between the adults despite their mother's scolding. Catherine stepped down from the train car, immediately struck by the vastness of the sky above, so different from Boston's confining buildings and narrow streets. "Miss Walsh?" The voice was deep, hesitant, and tinged with what sounded like nervousness. Catherine turned to find Robert Harrison approaching, hat in hand, his brown eyes studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 40, with sun lines around his eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. There was something gentle in his face, despite its ruggedness, a kindness that made her chest tighten with impending loss. "Mr. Harrison," she replied, managing a smile that felt more genuine than she'd expected. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Catherine felt an unexpected flutter of possibility. This man was nothing, like Marcus Pemberton, with his polished manners and calculating eyes. Robert Harrison looked at her as if she were something precious, something worth protecting, and the realization made her throat constrict with guilt. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Walsh," he said, his voice warming with obvious appreciation. "Your journey was comfortable, I hope. No delays or difficulties." "Very comfortable, thank you." "The autumn scenery was quite beautiful." Catherine gestured toward the mountains, visible in the distance. "Your letters didn't adequately describe how magnificent this country is." Robert's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Wait until you see the ranch. October's the best time of year. The aspen are turning gold in the high country, and the cattle are fat from summer grazing." He paused, then added more softly, "I've been looking forward to showing it to someone who might appreciate its beauty." The wistful note in his voice told Catherine more about his loneliness than any of his letters had. This was a man who'd been isolated, who'd been managing both ranch and household duties without companionship, who'd reached out for connection, with the same desperate hope that had driven her own advertisement, which made what she had to tell him even more cruel. "Mr. Harrison," she began, then stopped as a commotion erupted near the train car behind them. "Tommy! Tommy! Get back here!" A woman's voice, sharp with panic, cut through the platform noise. Catherine turned to see a boy of perhaps 8, darting between the adults, his face streaked with tears, his clothes disheveled as if he'd been traveling hard. Behind him, a frazzled-looking woman in a faded brown dress pursued him, calling his name with increasing desperation. "That's Mrs. Patterson from the orphanage in Cheyenne," Robert explained, his attention immediately shifting to the unfolding drama. "She brings children through every few months looking for families willing to take them in." The boy, Tommy, suddenly broke free from the crowd and ran directly toward Catherine and Robert, his small face wild with fear and determination. "Please!" he gasped, grabbing Robert's coat with grubby hands. "Please don't let her take us back. We'll work hard. We'll be good, just please don't make us go back to that place." Mrs. Patterson arrived moments later, breathless and clearly at the end of her patience. "I'm sorry, folks," she panted, reaching for Tommy's arm. "This one's been nothing but trouble since Denver. Come along, Thomas. The train won't wait." "No!" Tommy jerked away, positioning himself behind Robert as if the rancher could somehow shield him from whatever fate awaited. "We won't go back. Mary's sick, and Ben's trying to take care of her, but Mrs. Grimsby says sick children are too much." "Trouble!" Catherine's heart clenched at the raw desperation in the child's voice. She looked past Mrs. Patterson to see two other children huddled by the train car. A girl of perhaps 6, with fever-bright eyes, and a boy slightly older than Tommy trying to comfort her. All three were too thin, their clothes patched and ill-fitting, their faces bearing the hollow look of children who'd learned too young that the world was not a safe place. "Now see here," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice rising with embarrassment as other passengers began to stare. "These children are wards of the territorial orphanage, and I have legal authority—" "What orphanage?" Robert interrupted, his voice carrying a new edge. Catherine noticed his hands had unconsciously moved to Tommy's shoulders, a protective gesture that seemed as natural as breathing. Mrs. Patterson's flush deepened. "The territorial children's home in Cheyenne. Perfectly respectable institution, I assure you. These 3 are being relocated to a facility in Colorado that's better equipped to handle difficult cases." The way she said difficult cases while looking at the sick little girl made Catherine's stomach turn. She'd heard whispers about such institutions, overcrowded, underfunded places where unwanted children were warehoused rather than cared for. And if they're not relocated, Robert asked quietly, his tone deceptively calm. Mrs. Patterson's lips thinned. "That's hardly your concern, Mr. Harrison." "Robert Harrison. And any child's welfare is my concern when they're standing on my town's platform asking for help." Something had changed in Robert's demeanor. The gentle rancher was still there. But underneath, Catherine glimpsed steel, the kind of strength that protected rather than conquered. It was utterly different from Marcus Pemberton's entitled authority, and it stirred something in Catherine she'd thought dead forever. Tommy must have sensed the shift too, because his grip on Robert's coat tightened. "You're Mr. Harrison? The one with the big ranch outside town?" Robert looked down at the boy with surprise. "How did you know that?" heard the station master talking. "Said you raise the best cattle in the territory, and you're fair to work for, and—" Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "And you lost your family in the fever 2 years back." Pain flickered across Robert's face, quickly suppressed. "That's right, son. Then you know," Tommy said with the devastating directness of childhood. "You know what it's like to lose people, to be alone." The simple words hit their target with surgical precision. Catherine watched Robert's expression transform as he looked at the 3 children, seeing not problems to be solved, but souls in need of shelter. The realization that she was witnessing something profound, a moment that would change lives, made her own confession seem both more urgent and more impossible. "Mary's only 6. Tommy continued, his voice cracking. "She ain't done nothing wrong except get sick, and Ben tries so hard to take care of us, but he's only 10. We just need someone to give us a chance. We'll work, we'll help with the cattle. We won't be any trouble, I promise." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward impatiently. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but these children are not available for private adoption. They're being transferred to a specialized facility that can handle their particular needs." What particular needs? Catherine found herself asking, her teacher's instincts aroused by the woman's evasive language. Mrs. Patterson's gaze sharpened as she noticed Catherine for the first time. "And you are?" "Catherine Walsh," she replied, lifting her chin. "Mr. Harrison's intended." The lie came so naturally that it startled her. But something about these children, about Tommy's desperate courage and the sick little girl shivering by the train, had awakened every protective instinct she possessed. "I see." Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she saw more than Catherine intended. "Well, Miss Walsh, these children require specialized care that untrained individuals simply cannot provide. Mary has chronic lung weakness. Thomas has behavioral Difficulties and Benjamin, she shrugged. Let's simply say that some children are too damaged by their circumstances to thrive in normal family situations. The casual dismissal of 3 young lives as irredeemably damaged sent fury coursing through Catherine's veins. She'd been labelled damaged herself, deemed unfit for the normal life she'd dreamed of. The parallel was too painful and too precise. To ignore. Every child deserves a chance to thrive, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Perhaps what they need isn't a specialized institution, but a home where they're wanted. Robert looked at her with surprise and something that might have been admiration. Miss Walsh is a trained teacher, he said, the lie rolling off his tongue as smoothly as if they'd rehearsed it. She's well qualified to assess what children need. Catherine felt a flutter of panic at the fabrication, even as she appreciated his support. She had taught briefly before her illness, but that was hardly the extensive qualification he was implying. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. Mr. Harrison, while I appreciate your charitable impulses, the law requires these children to be delivered to their assigned facility. I cannot simply hand them over to strangers, no matter how well-meaning. What if they weren't strangers? Robert asked quietly. The question hung in the air while Catherine's heart began to race. Surely he wasn't suggesting, what if Miss Walsh and I were to petition for formal custody? As a married couple with means to provide for them? Catherine stared at him in shock. They'd known each other for exactly 10 minutes, and he was proposing not just marriage, but instant parenthood to 3 traumatized children. It was madness. It was impossible. It was also the most genuinely heroic thing she'd ever witnessed. Tommy looked up at Robert with desperate hope. You'd really do that? You'd take all 3 of us? I'd have to discuss it with Miss Walsh, Robert said carefully, his eyes finding Catherine's. It would be a significant responsibility. 3 children, 1 of them ill, all of them needing time and patience to heal. Catherine felt the weight of multiple gazes. Robert's cautious but hopeful, Tommy's desperate, Mrs. Patterson's skeptical, and from across the platform, 2 other children who'd crept closer to hear their fate decided. This was her moment of truth. She could confess her barrenness now, walk away from Robert Harrison and these children, return to Boston and a life of careful invisibility. Or she could step forward into something that terrified her, a role she'd never thought she could fill, with a man she barely knew, in a place that was utterly foreign to everything she'd ever experienced. But as she looked at little Mary, who was now coughing weakly against her brother Ben's shoulder, Catherine realized that some decisions made themselves. These children needed advocates, they needed someone to fight for them. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was why she'd really come west. Not to find a husband who could overlook her deficiencies, but to discover a purpose that rendered them irrelevant. I think, she said carefully, stepping closer to Robert and placing her hand lightly on Tommy's other shoulder, that 3 children would be lucky to have Mr. Harrison as their guardian, and I would be honored to help provide them with the home they deserve. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened in protest, but Robert was already moving, his decision clearly made. What legal steps would we need to take? He asked the older woman, and how quickly can they be completed? The battle for 3 young souls was about to begin, and Catherine Walsh, barren, broken and supposedly worthless, found herself preparing to fight the most important fight of her life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Cedar Falls Courthouse was a modest 2-story brick building that served multiple functions: courtroom, land office and marriage bureau, all housed under one roof. Catherine found herself seated on a hard wooden bench beside Robert Harrison, watching as he discussed legal procedures with Judge Samuel Morrison, a silver-haired man whose kind eyes belied his stern judicial demeanor. Tommy sat between Catherine and Robert, his small hand gripping hers with surprising strength, while Ben and Mary huddled together on the bench behind them. Mary's cough had worsened during the hour they'd spent navigating the legal requirements, and Catherine could see the fever flush on the child's pale cheeks growing more pronounced. "The territorial laws are quite clear," Judge Morrison was explaining to Mrs. Patterson, who had reluctantly accompanied them, after Robert's insistence that proper legal channels be followed. "Any married couple of good standing can petition for emergency custody of orphaned children, particularly when their current placement is unsuitable." "The placement is perfectly suitable," Mrs. Patterson snapped, her patience clearly exhausted. "The Riverside facility in Colorado has experience with difficult children." Difficult? Robert's voice carried a dangerous quiet that made Catherine look at him with surprise. "Tommy here has been nothing but polite and protective of his sister. Ben has shown remarkable maturity for a 10-year-old. And Mary," his gaze softened as he looked at the sick little girl, "Mary just needs someone to care whether she gets well or not." Judge Morrison nodded approvingly. "Mr. Harrison, your reputation in this community speaks for itself. Your late wife, Emma, was known for her charitable work, and your ranch has provided honest employment for many families. However," he paused, his eyes moving to Catherine, "the law requires both parties to the marriage to be present for the custody petition. Miss Walsh, you understand that taking on 3 children, particularly one with ongoing medical needs, is no small commitment." Catherine felt the weight of multiple gazes upon her, Mrs. Patterson's skeptical, Robert's hopeful, yet uncertain, and most importantly, 3 pairs of young eyes that held a lifetime's worth of disappointment and abandonment. She thought of her own recent experience with rejection, the crushing weight of being deemed insufficient for the role she'd most wanted to fill. "Your Honor," she said, rising to her feet with a composure she didn't feel, "I was a teacher in Boston before coming west. I've worked with children from various backgrounds and circumstances. While I cannot claim extensive experience with medical care, I believe that love, patience, and determination can overcome many challenges." It wasn't exactly a lie. She had taught briefly at a private academy before her engagement to Marcus. But she was stretching the truth about her qualifications, and the guilt of deception weighed heavily on her conscience. Tommy tugged at her skirt. "Miss Walsh," he whispered urgently, "Mary's getting worse." Catherine looked down to see that the little girl had slumped against Ben's shoulder, her breathing shallow and labored. Without thinking, she moved to the child's side, pressing her hand against Mary's forehead. The fever was definitely rising. "She needs medical attention," Catherine said firmly. "Judge Morrison, is there a doctor in town?" "Dr. Elizabeth Hartley," the judge replied, already reaching for his coat. "Just opened her practice here last month. First female physician in the territory. Came out from Chicago." He shot a meaningful look at Mrs. Patterson. "Perhaps we should address the child's immediate needs before debating legal technicalities." Mrs. Patterson's face flushed with indignation. "I am perfectly capable of assessing the child's condition. She has these episodes regularly. It's part of her chronic condition. Rest and patience are all that's required." "With respect," Catherine said, her teacher's instincts overriding social politeness, "a child with fever and labored breathing needs more than rest. She needs immediate medical evaluation." Robert was already lifting Mary into his arms, the little girl's head lolling against his shoulder. "Tommy, Ben, come with us. Mrs. Patterson, you're welcome to accompany us or not, but these children are getting medical attention now." The authority in his voice brooked no argument. As they left the courthouse, Catherine found herself walking beside a man she was beginning to realize was far more complex than his letters had suggested. The gentle rancher who wrote poetry about sunsets also possessed a protective instinct that could turn steel hard when children were threatened. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley's office occupied the ground floor of a neat white house on Cedar Falls, Main Street. A brass plaque beside the door announced her credentials. Graduated from the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, trained in pediatric medicine at Boston Children's Hospital. Catherine felt a flutter of hope. If this doctor had trained in Boston, she might understand the kind of medical sophistication that Mary required. Dr. Hartley herself proved to be a woman in her 30s with intelligent grey eyes and capable hands that immediately went to work examining Mary. She was thorough but gentle, talking to the little girl in soothing tones while assessing her breathing, checking her pulse, and listening to her chest with obvious concern. "How long has she had this cough?" Dr. Hartley asked, directing the question to whoever could answer. "About 3 months," Ben replied in a small voice. "Started after we got to the orphanage. Lots of kids were sick." The doctor's expression darkened. "I see. And has she received any medical treatment?" Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. "The orphanage has a contract with a local physician who visits monthly. Mary has been seen and treated appropriately. Monthly visits for a child with chronic respiratory distress." Dr. Hartley's tone was professionally neutral, but Catherine caught the edge of disapproval. "That's hardly adequate for ongoing care." She continued her examination while the adults watched tensely. Mary lay docilely on the examining table, too sick to protest the stranger's touch. Catherine found herself holding her breath, praying that whatever was wrong could be treated. "The good news," Dr. Hartley announced finally, "is that this appears to be pneumonia rather than something more serious like tuberculosis. The challenging news is that she's quite ill and will need intensive care for the next several days." "What kind of care?" Robert asked immediately. "Frequent administration of fever-reducing medications, steam treatments for her breathing, careful monitoring of her fluid intake, and most importantly," Dr. Hartley looked directly at Mrs. Patterson, "a clean, warm, quiet environment where she can rest without the stress of institutional living." Mrs. Patterson bristled. "The orphanage maintains perfectly adequate standards." "I'm sure it does," Dr. Hartley interrupted smoothly, "for healthy children, but Mary needs more specialized attention than a large institution can provide. In my medical opinion, she requires private care in a home environment." Catherine felt Robert's eyes on her, asking a question he couldn't voice. Could she do this? Could she care for a seriously ill child when she had no medical training and no experience with such responsibility? The answer came from somewhere deeper than logic or qualification. "What would her care involve specifically?" Catherine asked. "Dr. Hartley, I want to understand exactly what would be required." For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Hartley provided detailed instructions on medication schedules, steam tent procedures, dietary requirements, and warning signs to watch for. Catherine listened intently, taking mental notes and asking clarifying questions. Behind her, she could hear Tommy and Ben whispering anxiously to each other. "Doctor," Ben spoke up finally, his young voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "Is Mary gonna die like our ma did?" The stark question silenced the room. Dr. Hartley knelt down to Ben's eye level, her expression gentle but honest. "Your sister is very sick, Ben, but pneumonia can be treated if she gets the right care. The next few days will be critical, but I have every reason to believe she can recover fully." "If she gets the right care," Tommy repeated, looking at the adults with desperate hope. "That means someone has to take care of her proper, doesn't it?" Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Children, you must understand that the facility in Colorado has trained staff who see dozens of children every day," Catherine interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "Mary doesn't need trained staff. She needs someone who will sit up with her through the night, who will notice if her breathing changes, who will hold her when she's frightened." She looked at Robert. "She needs a family." Robert's answer came without hesitation. "Then that's what she'll have." "Mr. Harrison," Mrs. Patterson protested. "You cannot simply decide to adopt 3 children on a whim. There are procedures, evaluations, waiting periods. Emergency custody can be granted immediately when a child's welfare is at stake," Judge Morrison interjected. He had followed them to the doctor's office and had been listening quietly from the doorway. "Dr. Hartley, in your medical opinion, would moving Mary to Colorado in her current condition be advisable?" Dr. Hartley's response was immediate and decisive. "Absolutely not. This child should not be moved anywhere for at least a week, and then only to a stable, supportive environment. A long train journey to an unfamiliar institutional setting could be life-threatening in her current state." Judge Morrison nodded. "Then I'm prepared to grant temporary emergency custody to Mr. Harrison and Miss Walsh, pending their marriage and formal adoption proceedings." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This was happening so fast, spiraling far beyond anything she had imagined when she stepped off the train that morning. But as she looked at Mary's flushed face and heard the worried whispers of her brothers, Catherine realized that some moments demanded courage beyond preparation. "There's just one thing," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. Robert looked at her with concern, perhaps sensing that whatever she was about to say would change everything. Catherine took a deep breath, knowing that honesty might cost these children their chance at a home, but knowing equally that building a life on deception would ultimately destroy everyone involved. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice growing stronger with resolution, "before we proceed any further, there's something you need to know about me. Something that will affect your decision." Robert's eyes never left her face. "I'm listening." "I cannot have children of my own," Catherine said simply. "I contracted scarlet fever 3 years ago, and the complications left me unable to bear children. My previous engagement ended because of this. My family, well, they felt it best if I made a new start elsewhere." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I came west hoping to find someone who might want companionship, rather than motherhood. I should have told you in my letters, but I was afraid you would refuse to meet me." The silence stretched between them, while Catherine's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She had just confessed the secret that had destroyed her previous life, had made her damaged goods in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Mrs. Patterson made a small sound of satisfaction, as if Catherine's revelation had confirmed her suspicions about the unsuitability of this arrangement, but Robert's reaction was not what Catherine expected. "Catherine," he said gently, using her first name for the first time, "look around this room." She did, seeing Tommy and Ben watching anxiously, Mary lying pale but breathing on the examination table, Dr. Hartley observing with professional interest, Judge Morrison waiting patiently for resolution. "What do you see?" Robert asked. 3 children who need help," Catherine replied, confusion evident in her voice. "I see 3 children who need a mother," Robert corrected softly. "Not someone to bear them, but someone to love them, care for them, fight for them when necessary." His voice grew warmer. "Being unable to have children doesn't make you less of a woman, Catherine, but being willing to love someone else's children, that makes you exactly the kind of woman these 3 need." Tommy looked up at Catherine with sudden understanding. "You can't have babies, so you understand how it feels to want something you can't have?" The child's perception was startling in its accuracy. "Yes," Catherine whispered, tears threatening. "I understand exactly how that feels." "But you want us anyway?" Ben asked tentatively. "Even though we're not really yours." Catherine knelt down, so she was at eye level with both boys. "You would be really mine," she said firmly, "if you wanted to be. Family isn't just about blood, boys. It's about choosing to love each other every day, no matter what." Mary stirred on the examination table, her fever-bright eyes opening to focus on Catherine's face. "Are you the lady who's going to take care of us?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Catherine felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "If you'll let me, sweetheart, if you'll let me." Dr. Hartley cleared her throat softly. "I hate to interrupt this touching scene, but Mary needs to get settled somewhere she can rest. The medication I'm prescribing needs to be started immediately." Judge Morrison stepped forward. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Walsh, are you prepared to take legal responsibility for these 3 children as of today?" Robert looked at Catherine, a question in his eyes. Not about the children. She could see he had already decided about them, but about her, about whether she was prepared to step into a life that was completely different from anything she had planned. Catherine thought of the careful, respectable life she had imagined when she boarded the train that morning. A quiet marriage to a kind man, a peaceful existence in a small town, perhaps helping with ranch accounts or teaching local children. Safe, predictable, empty. Then she looked at 3 young faces turned toward her with desperate hope, and realized that some gifts came disguised as challenges. "Yes," she said firmly, "we're prepared." Mrs. Patterson made one final protest. "This is highly irregular. The territorial authorities will want to review. The territorial authorities will want these children to be safe, healthy, and loved." Judge Morrison interrupted with finality. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Walsh, report to my office tomorrow morning for the marriage ceremony and formal custody papers. Dr. Hartley, please provide detailed care instructions for Mary." As they prepared to leave the doctor's office, Catherine found herself walking beside Robert, while Tommy and Ben flanked them protectively, and Dr. Hartley carried Mary to Robert's wagon outside. "Catherine," Robert said quietly, so only she could hear, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." Her stomach tightened with apprehension. "Of course. Are you doing this because you feel sorry for these children, or because you want to build a life here with me?" The question was fair, and Catherine owed him complete honesty. She thought about it carefully as they reached the wagon, considering not just her immediate emotional reaction, but what she truly wanted for her future. "Both," she said, finally. "I do want to help these children. They deserve so much better than they've received. But Robert, when I watch you with them, when I see the man you really are—" She paused, gathering courage for complete honesty. "I think I could love you. Not the safe, practical love I thought I wanted, but something real and deep and lasting." Robert stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "And I think," he said with a smile that transformed his weathered face, "that a woman brave enough to take on 3 broken children and a lonely rancher might be exactly what this family needs." As they drove toward Robert's ranch, with 3 sleeping children in the wagon bed and the Wyoming sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine Walsh realized that sometimes the life you never planned turned out to be exactly the life you were meant to live. The Harrison Ranch sprawled across a valley that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the distant mountains, golden grassland dotted with cattle that looked like toys from the wagon seat. Catherine had never seen so much open space belonging to one person. It was both beautiful and overwhelming, this vast responsibility that Robert had built from nothing. 1,500 acres. Robert explained as they approached the main house, pride evident in his voice despite his exhaustion. "Took me and Emma 12 years to build it up from a homestead claim. She always said we'd need the space for—" He trailed off, glancing at the 3 children sleeping in the wagon bed. "Orphand, a large family," Catherine finished gently, understanding the painful irony. Robert had built an empire designed for children he'd lost, and now fate had delivered 3 orphans to fill that empty space. The house itself was more substantial than Catherine had expected. A 2-story structure of weathered wood with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the immediate area, speaking of a prosperous operation. But as they drew closer, Catherine noticed the subtle signs of a home without a woman's touch. curtains that hung crooked, a garden that had been practical rather than beautiful, steps that needed sweeping. "Robert," she said softly as he pulled the wagon to a stop, "before we go inside, I need to ask you something honestly. What did you tell the children about our arrangement? About why we're suddenly getting married tomorrow?" Robert's hands stilled on the reins. "I told them the truth, that sometimes people meet and recognize something important right away, that marriage is about partnership and commitment, not just romance from storybooks." It was a diplomatic answer, but Catherine sensed there was more. "And they accepted that? 3 children who've been abandoned multiple times just trusted that 2 strangers would suddenly want to take care of them. Tommy asked me directly if we were only doing this to help them," Robert admitted. "I told him that helping them was part of it, but that you and I had been corresponding for months. That we'd been planning to marry anyway." Catherine nodded slowly. It was close enough to the truth to be believable, and it protected the children from feeling like unwanted burdens. But it also created an expectation that she and Robert were further along in their relationship than they actually were. "Robert," she began, then stopped as Mary stirred in the wagon bed, her small voice calling weakly for water. "Inside first," Robert decided. "We'll figure out everything else as we go." The interior of the house was clean but sparse, furnished with solid, practical pieces that spoke of function over decoration. Catherine's first impression was of a home frozen in time, as if Robert had stopped caring about comfort the day he'd lost his family. "The master bedroom is upstairs," Robert said, carefully lifting Mary from the wagon. "I thought, that is, you and Mary should take it tonight. She'll need frequent attention, and there's a connecting door to the smaller bedroom where the boys can sleep." "Where will you sleep?" Catherine asked, following him up the stairs with her arms full of the few supplies Dr. Hartley had provided. "Downstairs on the couch, until—" He paused, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Until we sort things out properly." The master bedroom was larger than any space Catherine had ever called her own, with windows that looked out over the ranch valley. A massive bed dominated the room, covered with quilts that had clearly been made by loving hands. Emma's handiwork, Catherine realized, with a pang of something that wasn't quite jealousy, but wasn't entirely comfortable either. "These are beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the intricate stitching of one quilt. "Emma spent 3 winters on that one," Robert replied, settling Mary gently on the bed. "Always said it would be for our—" Again, he stopped himself. Mary's eyes fluttered open, fever bright but more alert than she'd been earlier. "Are we home now?" she asked, the question so innocent and hopeful that Catherine felt her throat tighten. "Yes, sweetheart," Catherine said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We're home." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Hartley's instructions required Mary to be given medication every 2 hours, and a steam tent needed to be set up using boiling water and towels. Catherine found herself moving through the house with increasing confidence, locating supplies, organizing the sick room, and coordinating with Robert as if they'd been partners for years rather than hours. Tommy and Ben proved to be remarkably helpful despite their young ages. Tommy appointed himself as Mary's entertainment committee, telling her stories and making silly faces to distract her during the uncomfortable steam treatments. Ben took charge of practical matters, locating clean linens and helping Catherine understand the layout of the house. "Mrs. Emma kept the medicines in the kitchen pantry," Ben informed Catherine as she searched for fever-reducing willow bark. "Mr. Robert showed us when we got here, said we should know where everything important was kept." Catherine paused in her search. "When you got here, haven't you just arrived today?" Ben looked confused. "Mr. Robert didn't tell you. We stayed here last night." The revelation stopped Catherine cold. Last night, But Mrs. Patterson said you were being transferred to Colorado today. We were, Tommy said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. But yesterday morning Mary got really sick and Mr. Robert was in town getting supplies. He saw Mrs. Patterson trying to load Mary onto the stage, even though she could barely breathe. Catherine sank into a kitchen chair, pieces of a larger picture beginning to form. What happened then? Mr. Robert told Mrs. Patterson that no child was traveling anywhere in that condition, Ben continued. Said he'd take legal responsibility for us until Mary was well enough to travel safely. So you've known Mr. Robert since yesterday? Catherine asked, her mind reeling. Tommy nodded enthusiastically. He's real nice, Miss Catherine. Made us pancakes for breakfast, and he's got 3 horses, and he said maybe he'd teach us to ride if we... He stopped, uncertainty clouding his young face. If we get to stay, I mean. Catherine's heart ached for the conditional hope in Tommy's voice. These children had learned not to expect permanence, to qualify every dream with if and maybe. Tommy, she said gently, would you like to stay here with Mr. Robert and me? The boy's face transformed with such pure joy that Catherine had to blink back tears. Really, forever and always, even if Mary stays sick sometimes, and even if Ben gets scared at night, and even if I accidentally break something, especially then, Catherine assured him. That's what families do. They stick together through all the difficult parts. As evening fell, Catherine found herself alone with Robert in the kitchen while the children slept upstairs. She was preparing Mary's next dose of medicine when Robert cleared his throat awkwardly. Catherine, about tomorrow, the marriage ceremony, I want you to know that I don't expect... That is, I understand this is all happening very fast. Catherine looked up from measuring willow bark powder. What are you trying to say, Robert? He ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling with how to approach the subject. I'm saying that marriage for the sake of the children doesn't have to mean intimate relations. We can take our time, get to know each other properly, sleep in separate rooms unless you decide you want more than just a partnership. The consideration behind his words touched Catherine deeply. Here was a man who could have demanded traditional marital rights as part of their arrangement, but instead was offering her choice and time. Robert, she said softly, may I ask you something personal? He nodded, wariness in his eyes. Yesterday, when you decided to help these children, was it really just about Mary being too sick to travel? Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the darkening sky. No, he said finally. It was about the way Tommy tried to make himself invisible when Mrs. Patterson was discussing their behavioral problems. It was about Ben asking me if all adults eventually got tired of taking care of children. It was about Mary whispering to her doll that she'd try to be good so maybe someone would keep her. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. You saw yourself in them. I saw what I never wanted any child to feel, unwanted, disposable, like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Robert turned to face her. My parents died when I was 15. I spent 3 years in situations that taught me exactly what it felt like to be considered a problem rather than a person. The parallel to Catherine's own recent experiences was unmistakable. Is that why you came west? To escape that feeling? Partly, but mostly to build something better, a place where people could start over, where past mistakes or circumstances didn't define them forever. He smiled ruefully. I just never expected to be starting over again myself. A soft cry from upstairs interrupted their conversation. Mary was calling for Catherine, her voice thick with fever and confusion. As Catherine hurried to the bedroom, she found all 3 children awake, Mary restless with discomfort, Tommy and Ben hovering anxiously beside the bed. She's burning up again, Ben reported, his young face creased with worry. And she's asking for someone named Mama, but she doesn't. I mean her real mama. Catherine's heart constricted as she realized Mary was calling for her. In her fever, the sick little girl had already begun to think of Catherine as the mother figure she desperately needed. For the next hour, Catherine sat beside Mary's bed, applying cool cloths to her forehead, administering medicine, and singing half-remembered lullabies from her own childhood. Robert appeared periodically to check on them, and gradually Tommy and Ben fell asleep curled together in the adjoining room. As Mary's fever finally broke near midnight, Catherine found herself truly alone with her thoughts for the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls. Tomorrow, she would marry a man she barely knew, legally adopt 3 traumatized children, and begin a life that bore no resemblance to anything she had planned. The magnitude of the changes should have terrified her. Instead, as she watched Mary sleep peacefully for the first time in days, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged. "Catherine?" Robert's voice was soft from the doorway. "How is she?" "Better. The fever broke about 20 minutes ago." Catherine rose carefully from the bedside chair, her back stiff from hours of sitting. "I think the worst is over." Robert stepped into the room, his eyes moving from Mary's peaceful face to Catherine's exhausted but triumphant expression. "You did it," he said with something like wonder in his voice. "You saved her." "We saved her," Catherine corrected. "All of us together." Robert moved closer, close enough that Catherine could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the relief, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken despite her fatigue. "Catherine," he said quietly, "I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever you decide about our marriage, you've already given these children something precious. You've given them hope. They've given me something too." Catherine replied honestly, "They've given me a purpose I never thought I'd have." Robert reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her cheek. "You're remarkable," he said simply. "Emma would have liked you very much." The mention of his late wife should have been awkward, but instead, Catherine felt honored by the comparison. "I hope I can live up to her memory." "You already have," Robert assured her, "by loving her children as if they were your own." As they stood together in the quiet bedroom, 3 children sleeping safely around them, Catherine realized that love came in many forms. The passionate romance she'd once dreamed of with Marcus Pemberton had been shallow and conditional. This partnership built on shared values and mutual respect, this commitment to something larger than themselves, felt far more solid and lasting. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Robert Harrison, mother to Tommy, Ben, and Mary, and mistress of a ranch that could provide security and love to anyone willing to work for it. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but as she looked at Robert's kind, weathered face in the lamplight, Catherine thought it might be something much better. It might be the life she was meant to live. Dawn broke over the Wyoming territory with a crisp October clarity that seemed to promise new beginnings. Catherine woke to the sound of Mary's steady, peaceful breathing. The first night in days, the little girl had slept without coughing fits or fever dreams. Sunlight streamed through the unfamiliar windows of what would soon legally become her bedroom, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the morning air. Today, she would marry Robert Harrison. Today, she would officially become mother to 3 children who had stolen her heart in less than 24 hours. Today, her real life would begin. A soft knock on the bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Catherine." Tommy's voice was cautious, respectful. "Mr. Robert says breakfast is ready and Mary's asking for you." Catherine rose carefully, not wanting to disturb Mary, and opened the door to find Tommy dressed in clothes that were clean but obviously too small for his growing frame. His hair had been carefully combed with water and his face scrubbed until it shone. "You look very handsome this morning," Catherine told him honestly. Tommy's chest puffed with pride. "Mr. Roberts said today's special, so we should look our best. Ben's been awake since before sunrise, and he found some flowers outside for Mary to hold during the ceremony." The thoughtfulness of these children, who had every reason to be cynical about adult promises, never ceased to amaze Catherine. "That's very sweet of Ben. How is Mary feeling?" "Much better," Mary's small voice piped up from the bed. "My chest doesn't hurt anymore, and I'm hungry." Catherine's heart lifted with relief. The crisis had passed, and Mary was truly on the mend. "Wonderful, sweetheart. Let's get you dressed and go see what Mr. Robert has made for breakfast." 20 minutes later, Catherine descended the stairs with Mary's hand in hers, following the scent of bacon and fresh coffee to the kitchen. The sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. Robert stood at the stove, his sleeves rolled up and an apron tied around his waist, flipping pancakes with the ease of long practice. Tommy was setting the table with careful precision, tongue poking out in concentration as he arranged mismatched plates and cups. Ben sat at the table folding napkins with military precision, a small bouquet of wild asters and late-blooming prairie roses lying beside his plate. But it was the transformation of the kitchen itself that took Catherine's breath away. Someone, Robert, she realized, had spent the early morning hours cleaning and organizing. The windows sparkled, the floor had been swept and mopped, and a vase of flowers similar to Ben's bouquet sat in the center of the now gleaming table. "You've been busy," Catherine observed, warmth flooding her chest at the obvious effort Robert had made. Robert turned from the stove, his weathered face slightly flushed with heat and what might have been embarrassment. "Wanted everything to be nice for today." His eyes met hers across the kitchen. "For our wedding day." The simple words sent an unexpected thrill through Catherine. Despite the unconventional circumstances, despite the fact that they barely knew each other, this was her wedding day. She was about to promise herself to this kind, honorable man who made pancakes for orphaned children and cleaned his house at dawn to honor their union. "It's perfect," she said softly, and meant it completely. Breakfast was a lively affair, with Mary eating more than she had in days, and the boys peppering Robert and Catherine with questions about the ceremony. Would there be a church? Would the whole town attend? Would Catherine wear a white dress? "The ceremony will be at the courthouse," Robert explained patiently. "Judge Morrison will perform it, and Dr. Hartley will be there as our witness. She needs to check on Mary anyway. As for guests," he glanced at Catherine, "I thought we'd keep it simple, just the 5 of us." Catherine nodded gratefully. The idea of a public ceremony, with curious townspeople evaluating their hasty marriage, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Simple sounds perfect. But what about a wedding dress?" Tommy asked, with the practical concern of a child who'd absorbed. "Adult worries too young. Don't ladies need special dresses for getting married?" Catherine looked down at her traveling outfit, the same green wool dress she'd worn yesterday, now wrinkled from sleeping in a chair beside Mary's bed. It was hardly bridal attire, but it would have to suffice. "I think Miss Catherine looks beautiful just as she is," Robert said firmly, his eyes warm as they met hers. "But actually," he paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision, "there might be something upstairs that would work, if you're comfortable with it." 20 minutes later, Catherine stood before the mirror in the master bedroom, staring at her reflection in disbelief. The dress Robert had hesitantly offered was clearly Emma's, a deep blue silk with delicate pearl buttons and ivory lace at the collar and cuffs. It was elegant without being ostentatious, sophisticated yet practical, and it fit Catherine as if it had been made for her. "Emma was about your size," Robert had explained quietly when he'd retrieved it from the wardrobe. "She wore this to church. On Sundays' special occasions. I thought she'd want it to be useful again rather than just hanging there." Now as Catherine smoothed the silk skirt and touched the delicate lace, she felt a strange connection to the woman who had worn this dress before her. Emma Harrison had been loved, had been part of building this ranch and this life that Catherine was about to inherit. Rather than feeling like an intruder, Catherine felt as if she were being welcomed into a legacy of love and partnership. A soft tap on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Catherine?" Mary's voice was curious. "Can we—" See, Catherine opened the door to find all three children clustered in the hallway, their faces lighting up when they saw her. "You look like a princess," Mary breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "You look like a mama," Tommy said with simple honesty that made Catherine's throat tighten with emotion. Ben stepped forward shyly, holding his carefully gathered bouquet. "These are for you," he said formally, "for your wedding." Catherine accepted the wildflowers with hands that trembled slightly. "They're beautiful, Ben, thank you so much." As they prepared to leave for town, Catherine caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror and was startled by the transformation. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the defeated, rejected mail-order bride who had stepped off the train yesterday. This woman looked purposeful, loved, surrounded by family. This woman looked like she belonged. The courthouse ceremony was brief but meaningful. Judge Morrison spoke about partnership, commitment, and the responsibilities of marriage with a gravity that suited the occasion. Dr. Hartley served as witness with professional dignity, occasionally checking Mary's breathing and color with a physician's automatic concern. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Robert's kiss was gentle, respectful but unmistakably real. As their lips met, Catherine felt something shift inside her, not just legal status, but a sense of coming home to herself. The custody papers were signed immediately after the marriage certificate, making Tommy, Ben, and Mary legally the children of Robert and Catherine Harrison. Watching the children sign their names to the adoption documents with painstaking care, Catherine realized they understood the magnitude of this moment as clearly as any adult. "Are we really a family now?" Mary asked as they prepared to leave the courthouse. "Really and truly," Catherine assured her, lifting the little girl into her arms. "Forever and always." The celebration was interrupted by an unexpected complication. As they emerged from the courthouse, they were confronted by a well-dressed woman in her 50s, accompanied by a younger man in a rumpled suit who carried an official-looking briefcase. "Mr. Harrison," the woman called imperiously. "A word, if you please." Robert's expression immediately became guarded. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wasn't expecting to see you in Cedar Falls." The woman, Mrs. Whitmore, smiled thinly. "Urgent business, I'm afraid. This is Mr. Jameson from the Territorial Child Welfare Board. We've received some concerning reports about the irregular placement of certain orphaned children." Catherine felt the children press closer to her and Robert, instinctively sensing threat. Tommy's hand found hers and gripped tightly. Mr. Jameson stepped forward, consulting a sheaf of papers. "Mr. Harrison, I understand you've taken custody of 3 minor children without following proper territorial procedures. The Children's Welfare Board has strict protocols for placement designed to ensure the safety and appropriate care of orphaned minors." "These children were in immediate danger," Robert replied evenly. "Mary required urgent medical care that couldn't be provided during transport to Colorado. Judge Morrison granted emergency custody to prevent further harm." "Emergency. Custody is a temporary measure," Mrs. Whitmore interjected smoothly. "These children belong in a proper institutional setting where their needs can be professionally assessed and met." Dr. Hartley, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward with professional authority. "Mrs. Whitmore, I examined these children yesterday. Mary was suffering from acute pneumonia that could have been fatal without immediate intervention. The institutional placement you're advocating would have been medically irresponsible. Mrs. Whitmore's smile became even thinner. Dr. Hartley, while I respect your medical opinion, child welfare involves more than temporary health concerns. These children have been traumatized, possibly damaged by their experiences. They require specialized care that untrained individuals cannot provide. What kind of specialized care? Catherine asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. Mr. Jameson consulted his papers again. The Riverside facility in Colorado employs trained staff experienced in managing difficult children. They have protocols for dealing with behavioral problems, educational deficiencies, and the psychological damage common in abandoned children. Catherine felt fury building in her chest. These bureaucrats spoke about Tommy, Ben, and Mary as if they were broken objects to be managed rather than children to be loved. "Mr. Jameson," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "have you spoken with these children? Have you asked them what they want?" "Children are not qualified to make decisions about their own welfare," Mrs. Whitmore replied dismissively. "They lack the maturity to understand what's truly in their best interests." Tommy, who had been listening with growing distress, suddenly spoke up. "I understand plenty," he said, his young voice shaking with emotion. "I understand that the orphanage in Cheyenne was cold and hungry and nobody cared if kids got sick. I understand that Mary almost died there and nobody wanted to help her. I understand that Mr. Robert and Mrs. Catherine, saved her life and want to take care of us." Ben stepped forward to stand beside his brother. "We don't want to go to Colorado. We want to stay here where people love us." Mary, still in Catherine's arms, buried her face against Catherine's shoulder, but her muffled voice was clear. "I want my mama, Catherine." The simple declaration hit Catherine like a physical blow. In less than 2 days, she had become mama to a little girl who had every reason to distrust adult promises. Judge Morrison, who had been observing the confrontation from the courthouse steps, descended with judicial authority. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Jameson, I presume you have court orders authorizing you to remove these children from their legally appointed guardians." Mr. Jameson shuffled through his papers uncomfortably. "We have authorization to investigate irregular placements, Your Honor. Final removal orders would require a formal hearing with evidence of unfitness or danger," Judge Morrison interrupted. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison are now the legal guardians of these children, appointed through proper emergency procedures due to documented medical necessity. Unless you can present evidence of abuse, neglect, or unfitness, you have no authority to remove these children." Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked slightly. "Your Honor, surely you can see that this entire situation is highly irregular. A hasty marriage between strangers, children placed without proper evaluation. What I see," Judge Morrison replied firmly, "is a woman who risked her own reputation to care for a critically ill child, a man who opened his home to 3 orphans, without hesitation, and children who are clearly thriving in their new environment." He gestured to where Tommy and Ben flanked Catherine protectively, while Mary clung to her with obvious trust. "The territorial authorities will hear about this," Mrs. Whitmore threatened. "There will be a full investigation." "I welcome it," Robert said quietly. "These children have nothing to hide from, and neither do we." As Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Jameson departed with obvious frustration, Catherine realized that their newfound happiness faced challenges she hadn't anticipated. There would be inspections, evaluations, bureaucrats looking for reasons to tear their family apart. But as she felt the solid warmth of Mary in her arms, Tommy's hand still gripping hers, and Ben's protective stance beside Robert, Catherine knew, with absolute certainty, that she would fight any force that tried to separate them. They were a family now, formed by choice rather than blood, and no amount of official disapproval would change that fundamental truth. The real battle for their future was just beginning. 3 weeks into their marriage, Catherine discovered that creating a family was like tending a garden. It required impatience, consistent care, and the faith that roots would eventually grow deep enough to withstand any storm. What she hadn't expected was how quickly those storms would arrive. The Harrison Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt surprisingly natural. Tommy had appointed himself chief assistant to Robert, following the rancher everywhere and absorbing lessons about cattle, horses, and land management with the intensity of a boy who'd finally found a father figure worth emulating. Ben had claimed the kitchen as his domain, proving unexpectedly talented at cooking simple meals and managing household supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd learned early that survival depended on careful resource management. Mary had blossomed under consistent care and attention, her health improving daily as her appetite returned and her natural curiosity emerged. She followed Catherine everywhere, chattering constantly about everything from the patterns clouds made in the sky to the names she'd given each of the barn cats. But it was the changes in Catherine herself that proved most surprising. The woman, who had once measured her worth by her ability to bear children, had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. Managing a household of 5, overseeing Mary's continued recovery, teaching the boys basic literacy during evening lessons by lamplight, and gradually learning the complexities of ranch life, had awakened a competence and confidence she'd never experienced in her carefully circumscribed Boston existence. This morning, however, brought a reminder that their peaceful domesticity existed. Under constant threat, Catherine was hanging laundry behind the house, enjoying the crisp autumn air, and Mary's running commentary on each item. "That's Tommy's favorite shirt, the blue one, and it has a hole by the pocket that Ben tried to mend, but it looks like a spider now." When a cloud of dust on the horizon announced approaching visitors, Robert emerged from the barn, Tommy close behind him, both men immediately alert to potential trouble. In the 3 weeks since Mrs. Whitmore's confrontation at the courthouse, they'd learned to view unexpected visitors with suspicion. 3 riders, Robert observed, shading his eyes against the morning sun. One of them's wearing a badge. Catherine's stomach clenched with anxiety. She quickly gathered Mary into her arms while Ben appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour-covered hands on his apron with the worried expression of a child who'd learned that official visits rarely brought good news. The lead rider proved to be Sheriff Coleman from the county seat, a weathered man in his 50s whose reputation for fairness was well established throughout the territory. Behind him rode 2 men Catherine didn't recognize, one elderly with the stern bearing of a career bureaucrat, the other younger and nervously consulting a leather portfolio. "Afternoon, Robert," Sheriff Coleman called as the trio approached the house. "Sorry to bother you folks, but I've got some official business to discuss." Robert's posture remained relaxed, but Catherine caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. "Sheriff, what can I do for you? This here is Mr. Augustus Fairchild from the Territorial Child Welfare Board," Sheriff Coleman announced, gesturing to the elderly man, "and Mr. Peters, his assistant. They're here to conduct an inspection of your household arrangements." Mr. Fairchild dismounted with the stiff movements of someone unaccustomed to ranch life, his city clothes and polished boots marking him as distinctly out of place in the rural setting. His pale eyes swept over the scene before him, the neat ranch buildings, the children clustered protectively near Catherine and Robert, the obvious prosperity of the operation, with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Harrison," he said formally, removing his hat with perfunctory politeness. "I trust you're expecting us?" Catherine and Robert exchanged glances. They'd received no notification of this inspection, though they'd been anticipating something of the sort since Mrs. Whitmore's threats. "Can't say we were," Robert replied evenly, "but you're welcome to look around. We've got nothing to hide." Mr. Fairchild's thin smile suggested he doubted that assertion. Mr. Peters will be conducting interviews with the children individually, while I evaluate the living conditions and educational provisions. This is a standard assessment to ensure that territorial standards for child welfare are being maintained. Tommy stepped closer to Robert, his young face set with determination. Do we have to talk to them if we don't want to? Now, young man, Mr. Fairchild said with the condescending tone adults often used with children they considered problems, these interviews are for your own protection. We need to ensure that you're being properly cared for. We are being properly cared for, Ben said quietly but firmly. Better than we've ever been cared for. Mr. Fairchild made a note in his portfolio. I see. Well, we'll conduct our evaluation according to established procedures. He turned to Catherine. Mrs. Harrison, I'll need to examine the children's sleeping arrangements, their educational materials, and your household management systems. For the next 2 hours, Catherine endured the most invasive inspection of her life. Mr. Fairchild examined every room in the house with the thoroughness of a detective investigating a crime scene. He questioned her about meal planning, educational, curricular, disciplinary methods, and financial arrangements with a precision that suggested he was looking for specific violations rather than general welfare. Meanwhile, Mr. Peters interviewed each child separately, despite their obvious reluctance. Catherine could hear fragments of the conversations through the parlor door, questions about sleeping arrangements, punishment methods, whether they felt safe, whether they missed their previous placements. Tommy emerged from his interview with blazing eyes and clenched fists. He asked if Mr. Robert ever hit us, he announced indignantly, and if you made us work too hard, and if we got enough food, and if anyone ever touched us in ways that made us uncomfortable. The boy's voice rose with outrage. Like we're too stupid to know the difference between people who love us and people who hurt us. Catherine felt her own anger rising at the implication that their loving home was somehow suspect, but she forced herself to remain calm. What did you tell him, Tommy? I told him that Mr. Robert never even raises his voice at us, and that you make sure we have seconds at dinner even when you don't, and that nobody's ever been nicer to us in our whole lives. Tommy's young face was fierce with loyalty. I told him he was stupid if he couldn't see how happy we are. Ben emerged from his interview looking shaken but resolute. When Catherine asked how it went, he simply said, I told them the truth, that this is the first place that's ever felt like home. Mary's interview was mercifully brief, perhaps because Mr. Peters recognized that a 6-year-old's testimony would carry less weight. But when she skipped out of the parlor and announced that she'd told the man that Catherine was the best mama in the whole world, Catherine felt tears threaten despite her determination to remain strong. Mr. Fairchild's inspection of the house was equally thorough and apparently fruitless from his perspective. The children's rooms were clean and comfortable, their clothing adequate and well-maintained. The kitchen was well-stocked. The educational materials Catherine had ordered from Denver were age-appropriate and in regular use, and the overall atmosphere was one of a prosperous, well-managed household. Your household appears to meet basic, material standards, Mr. Fairchild admitted grudgingly as he concluded his inspection. However, there are concerns about the rushed nature of this placement, the lack of proper psychological evaluation of the children, and the questionable motivations behind your sudden marriage. Robert's jaw tightened. Questionable motivations? Mr. Harrison, you corresponded with Mrs. Harrison for months before her arrival, yet within 24 hours of meeting her, you'd married her and adopted 3 children. Such hasty decisions suggest either poor judgment or ulterior motives. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Fairchild, what ulterior motives could we possibly have? We receive no financial compensation for caring for these children. We've provided them with food, shelter, medical care, education, and love at our own expense. There are those who take in children for the labor they can provide, Mr. Fairchild replied coldly. Others who seek to appear respectable by taking on charitable cases. Still others who... He let his voice trail off meaningfully. The implication was clear and insulting. Catherine felt Robert tense beside her, his protective instincts aroused by the suggestion that their motivations were anything but pure. Sheriff Coleman, who had been observing the proceedings with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. Now see, here, Fairchild, I've known Robert Harrison for 10 years. He's as decent a man as you'll find in this territory, and anyone with eyes can see these children are thriving. Sheriff Coleman, I appreciate your confidence in Mr. Harrison's character, Mr. Fairchild replied stiffly. But the Territorial Child Welfare Board has standards that must be maintained regardless of local opinion. What standards? Tommy demanded, his young voice cracking with emotion. The standard that says we should be locked up in some horrible place in Colorado, instead of living here where people actually want us. Mr. Fairchild's expression hardened. Young man, you will speak respectfully to adults. I'll speak respectfully to adults who deserve respect. Tommy shot back with a courage that made Catherine's heart swell with pride, even as she worried about the consequences. Tommy, Robert said quietly, his voice carrying gentle authority. Come here, son. The word son was deliberate, Catherine realized, a public claim of family relationship that no bureaucrat could ignore. Tommy moved immediately to Robert's side, his anger subsiding under the rancher's calm influence. Mr. Fairchild, Robert continued, his arm settling protectively around Tommy's shoulders. What exactly are you looking for here? Because if it's evidence that these children are loved, educated, and cared for, you've found it. If you're looking for evidence of abuse or neglect, you're wasting your time because it doesn't exist. Mr. Fairchild consulted his notes with obvious frustration. Mr. Harrison, the board has received reports suggesting that this placement is irregular, that proper procedures weren't followed, and that the children's long-term welfare may not be adequately protected. Reports from whom? Catherine asked sharply. Mr. Fairchild's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. Mrs. Whitmore and her allies were behind this inspection, using bureaucratic channels to continue their harassment. The source of our concerns is confidential, Mr. Fairchild said finally. What matters is that the board has a responsibility to investigate any situation that may not be in a child's best interest. Mary, who had been quietly watching the adult conversation with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Fairchild, are you going to take us away from Mama Catherine and Papa Robert? The simple question, asked with a 6-year-old's directness, seemed to catch the bureaucrat off guard. For a moment his stern facade cracked, revealing something that might have been uncertainty. We're evaluating what arrangement would be best. For your welfare, child, he said more gently. This arrangement is best for our welfare, Ben said firmly. We know because we've lived in other places and they weren't good. This is good. This is home. Mr. Peters, who had been taking notes throughout the exchange, leaned close to Mr. Fairchild and whispered something Catherine couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it seemed to influence the older man's decision. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Fairchild announced formally, our preliminary assessment finds no immediate evidence of abuse or severe neglect. However, the board will be conducting a full review of this placement over the next 60 days. During that period, the children will remain in your custody, but you should be prepared for additional inspections and evaluations. It was a reprieve, but not a victory. Catherine felt relief wash through her, followed immediately by renewed anxiety about what the next 60 days might bring. As the officials prepared to leave, Sheriff Coleman approached Catherine and Robert privately. Listen, he said quietly, I don't know who's pushing this investigation, but they're not giving up easy. You folks need to be real careful, dot every I, cross every T. Don't give them any excuse to find fault. After the riders disappeared over the horizon, Catherine sank onto the porch steps, suddenly exhausted by the strain of the inspection. Robert sat beside her, while the children clustered around them like chicks seeking shelter from a storm. We going to be okay?" Mary asked in a small voice. Catherine gathered the little girl onto her lap, looking out over the ranch that had become home to all of them. "Yes, sweetheart," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We're going to be okay. We're a family, and families stick together no matter what." But as she spoke the words, Catherine realized that their greatest challenge wasn't building a home, it was defending the right to keep it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks into their probationary period, delivered by a nervous-looking postal clerk who seemed eager to escape the ranch as quickly as possible. Catherine's hands trembled as she broke the official territorial seal, dreading another summons or inspection notice. Instead, she found something unexpected, a request from Dr. Hartley, asking her to come to town immediately on a matter of urgent importance regarding your family's situation. The cryptic message sent alarm bells through Catherine's mind. Dr. Hartley had become a trusted friend over the past month, regularly checking on Mary's continued recovery and offering quiet support during the tense period of official scrutiny. For her to request an urgent meeting suggested either medical concerns or something related to the Welfare Board's ongoing investigation. "I have to go into town," Catherine told Robert, who was repairing a fence near the house with Tommy's enthusiastic but inexpert assistance. "Dr. Hartley needs to see me about something important." Robert's expression immediately grew concerned. "About Mary? Has she been showing any symptoms?" "No, Mary's fine. This is about our family situation, whatever that means." Catherine folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket. "Can you watch the children while I'm gone?" "Of course." "But Catherine—" Robert set down his hammer and moved closer, lowering his voice so Tommy wouldn't overhear. "Maybe I should come with you. If this is about the Welfare Board, someone needs to stay with the children," Catherine interrupted gently. "And honestly, I think Dr. Hartley might speak more freely if she's just talking to another woman." Robert nodded reluctantly, understanding the dynamics, even if he didn't like leaving Catherine to face potential bad news alone. An hour later, Catherine found herself in Dr. Hartley's office, sitting across from the physician who had become their staunchest advocate. But today, Dr. Hartley's usual composed demeanor showed cracks of agitation. "Catherine, thank you for coming so quickly," Dr. Hartley began, then paused, seeming to struggle with how to proceed. "What I'm about to tell you is complicated. It involves information I probably shouldn't have, obtained through channels that weren't entirely proper." Catherine's stomach tightened. "What kind of information?" Dr. Hartley rose from her desk and moved to the window, gazing out at Cedar Falls Main Street with troubled eyes. "I have a colleague in Denver, Dr. Margaret Thornfield. We attended medical school together, and we've maintained a correspondence over the years. She's been practicing there for nearly a decade." The name struck Catherine like a physical blow. "Dr. Thornfield, Margaret Thornfield. You know her?" Dr. Hartley turned back to Catherine, surprise evident in her voice. "She's my cousin," Catherine whispered, her mind reeling. "My mother's sister's daughter. But the last I heard, she was studying to be a teacher, not a physician." Dr. Hartley's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Catherine, Margaret has been following your case through mutual acquaintances in Denver's medical community. She knows about your marriage to Robert, the adoption of the children, and the Welfare Board's investigation." "How could she possibly know about any of that?" "Because," Dr. Hartley said carefully, "she's the physician who wrote the medical certificate declaring you barren." The words hit Catherine like a physical assault. She gripped the arms of her chair, feeling as if the room had tilted on its axis. That's impossible. Dr. Thornfield was a man, an elderly physician in Boston. There was no Dr. Thornfield in Boston, Catherine. Margaret created that identity to protect her own reputation while providing you with the documentation you requested. Catherine stared at Dr. Hartley in complete bewilderment. Documentation I requested. I never requested anything. Dr. Thornfield examined me after my bout with scarlet fever and pronounced me unable to have children. Dr. Hartley's face went pale. Catherine, you need to understand, Margaret never examined you. You came to her office in Denver requesting a medical certificate stating that you were barren. You said you needed it to escape an unwanted engagement and that you were prepared to pay well for the service. The accusation was so shocking, so completely contrary to Catherine's memory of events, that for a moment she couldn't process it. That's not what happened, she said weakly. I was sick, I recovered, but the complications... According to Margaret's records, you were never her patient for any illness. You appeared at her office 6 months ago, offering money for a false medical certificate. She was struggling financially at the time, and she made a decision she's regretted ever since. Catherine felt the world spinning around her. Nothing Dr. Hartley was saying made sense, yet the woman's obvious distress suggested she believed every word. Why are you telling me this now? Catherine managed to ask. Dr. Hartley returned to her desk, pulling out a letter with obvious reluctance. Because Margaret wrote to me 3 days ago. She's been contacted by Mrs. Whitmore's people. They're offering her substantial money to testify that you're a fraud who obtained false medical documentation to deceive potential husbands. The revelation hit Catherine like a sledgehammer. She's going to testify against me? She's considering it. Her practice in Denver is failing, and Mrs. Whitmore's people are offering enough money to save it. But Catherine... Dr. Hartley leaned forward earnestly. Margaret is also racked with guilt about her part in this deception. She knows that testifying would destroy your family, and she's genuinely conflicted. Catherine's mind raced through the implications. If this story came out during the Welfare Board's review, it would destroy everything. Robert would learn that their entire marriage was based on a lie, not just the withholding of information, but active deception. The children would be removed immediately. Her life in Wyoming would be over. But more than that, Catherine was struggling with the fundamental claim that she had never been sick, never been examined, never been told she was barren. The entire foundation of her self-understanding for the past 3 years was being called into question. Dr. Hartley, Catherine said carefully, I need you to understand something. I have no memory of going to Denver, of meeting your cousin, or of requesting any false documentation. My recollection is that I was examined by Dr. Thornfield in Boston after recovering from scarlet fever. Dr. Hartley studied Catherine's face intently, her physician's training evident in the careful assessment. You truly don't remember any of this? I remember being very ill, and I remember the devastating diagnosis, but... Catherine paused, forcing herself to think more carefully about those dark months 3 years ago. Actually, the details are hazy. I was so distraught by the news that I may have blocked out some of the specifics. Catherine, is it possible that you never actually had scarlet fever? That you created the entire story as justification for the false medical certificate? The suggestion should have outraged Catherine, but instead it sent a chill of uncertainty through her. Were her memories of being inaccurate, or had they been constructed to support a deception she'd somehow forgotten? I don't know, Catherine admitted quietly. I honestly don't know what's real anymore. Dr. Hartley's expression softened with sympathy. Catherine, regardless of what happened 3 years ago, I need you to know that Margaret is genuinely torn about whether to testify. She's not an evil person. She's a woman who made a desperate decision and has regretted it ever since. Is there any way to stop her? Possibly. Mrs. Whitmore's people are planning to bring Margaret to Cedar Falls next week to give her testimony to Mr. Fairchild. But if Margaret could be convinced to refuse... Catherine felt a spark of hope. You think she might be persuaded? I think she might be if the right person approached her. Someone who could appeal to her better nature, who could help her understand what's at stake for you and the children. Catherine understood immediately. You want me to go to Denver to talk to her? It's risky, Dr. Hartley warned. If Mrs. Whitmore's people discover you've contacted Margaret, they might accelerate their timeline, but it might be your only chance to save your family. As Catherine walked back to the ranch, her mind churned with conflicting emotions and half-remembered fragments that might or might not be real memories. Had she really deceived Robert about her condition? Was her entire understanding of her past 3 years based on a lie she'd constructed? More importantly, did it matter? Regardless of whether she could bear children, regardless of how she'd come to believe otherwise, she loved Robert and the children with all her heart. They had built something real and precious together, something worth fighting for. When she arrived home, she found Robert teaching Tommy and Ben how to properly stack hay bales, while Mary played nearby with a family of barn kittens. The domestic scene filled her with both love and terror. Love for what they'd created, terror at how easily it could all be destroyed. How did your meeting go? Robert asked, immediately reading the distress in her expression. Catherine looked at him, this good, honourable man who had opened his home and heart to her and 3 orphaned children, and felt the weight of her deception crushing down on her. He deserved the truth, but the truth might destroy everything they'd built. We need to talk, she said quietly. Tonight, after the children are asleep. Robert's expression grew troubled, but he nodded. Whatever it is, Catherine, we'll face it together. As she watched him return to his lesson with the boys, Catherine prayed that his promise would still hold true once he learned that the woman he'd married might be someone entirely different from who he thought she was. The conversation that would determine their family's fate was still hours away, but Catherine could already feel the foundations of their life beginning to shift beneath her feet. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to travel to Denver to confront her past or watch Mrs. Whitmore's forces destroy her future. Either way, the next few days would test whether love built on uncertain ground could survive the earthquake of absolute truth. The train to Denver left Cedar Falls at dawn, carrying Catherine toward a confrontation with a past she was no longer certain she understood. As the Wyoming landscape rolled past her window, she replayed the previous night's conversation with Robert, the most difficult hours of her life. She had told him everything: Dr. Hartley's revelations, Margaret's potential testimony, Mrs. Whitmore's scheme to destroy their family. What she hadn't been able to tell him was whether any of it was true, because she genuinely didn't know anymore. Robert's reaction had been everything she could have hoped for, and more. No anger, no accusations, no demands for explanations she couldn't provide. Instead, he had taken her hands in his and spoken with the quiet certainty that had first drawn her to him. "Catherine," he had said, "I don't care what happened 3 years ago in Denver or Boston or anywhere else. I care about the woman who sat up all night nursing Mary back to health. I care about the woman who defended our family against bureaucrats and inspectors. I care about the woman who makes Tommy laugh and teaches Ben to read and gives us all a reason to believe in tomorrow." But even Robert's unwavering support couldn't quiet the storm of doubt raging in Catherine's mind. Who was she really? The victim of a devastating medical diagnosis, or a desperate woman who had fabricated her entire tragic backstory? The answer waited in Denver, in the form of a cousin she barely remembered and medical records that would either vindicate or condemn her. The train pulled into Denver's bustling station just after noon, and Catherine felt overwhelmed by the noise and crowds after weeks of ranch life. She had arranged to meet Margaret at a small cafe near the medical district, chosen for its privacy and neutral ground. Catherine arrived first, claiming a corner table where she could observe the entrance while remaining partially hidden behind a decorative screen. Her hands shook as she ordered coffee she couldn't taste, her entire body tense with anticipation and dread. Margaret Thornfield entered the cafe precisely at the appointed time, and Catherine felt a shock of recognition. Despite the years that had passed, her cousin had grown into a striking woman with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a dark blue dress that spoke of professional respectability, but Catherine noticed the careful mending at the cuffs and the worn quality of the fabric that suggested financial struggles. Catherine. Margaret's voice was hesitant as she approached the table, her expression a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "Hello, Margaret." Catherine rose to embrace her. "Cousin," noting how thin she had become, how worry lines had etched themselves around her eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." They sat in awkward silence for several minutes, each apparently waiting for the other to begin. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Catherine, I need you to know that I've regretted that day every moment since it happened. When I heard about your marriage, about the children you've taken in, about the investigation." She stopped, tears threatening. "I never imagined my decision would affect innocent children." Catherine studied her cousin's face, searching for truth in features that had once been familiar. "Margaret, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. In that day, every detail you can remember." Margaret nodded, taking a shaky breath before beginning. "It was March 15th, 6 months ago. You came to my office in the late afternoon, just before closing. You were different from the Catherine I remembered, harder somehow, more desperate. Different how? You seemed calculating, determined. You said you needed a medical certificate stating that you were barren, that you were willing to pay $50 for it, more money than I made in a month at the time." Margaret's voice grew smaller. "You said you needed to escape an engagement to a man who would ruin your life, that this was the only way to make him reject you, instead of you having to reject him." Catherine felt a chill of recognition. The description of wanting to escape Marcus Pemberton was accurate, but the method— "Did I mention scarlet fever? Any illness?" Margaret shook her head. "No illness. You specifically said you'd never been seriously sick, that you needed me to fabricate a medical history that would make you unmarriageable." She paused, studying Catherine's face. "You really don't remember any of this, do you?" "I remember being devastated by Marcus's rejection after my supposed diagnosis," Catherine said slowly. "I remember feeling broken, worthless. But the details of how I got that diagnosis—" She trailed off, fragments of memory beginning to shift and realign in her mind. "Catherine, there's something else," Margaret said quietly. "Something that's been bothering me since I agreed to create that certificate." "What?" "You knew things about me that day, about my financial troubles, about my failed engagement to Dr. Peterson, about my struggles to establish a practice as a female physician. Things that only someone who had been researching me would know." Implication hit Catherine like a physical blow. "You think I sought you out specifically, that I planned the whole thing?" "I think you were much more desperate and much more calculating than either of us wants to admit," Margaret replied gently. "But Catherine, that doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a woman who was trapped and did what she thought she had to do to survive." As Margaret spoke, Catherine felt pieces of suppressed memory beginning to surface. A train journey to Denver she'd forgotten, hours spent in a boarding house room, crafting a story that would convince a desperate physician. to compromise her ethics, the careful research into her cousin's situation, the deliberate appeal to Margaret's financial needs. "Oh God," Catherine whispered as the full scope of her deception became clear. "I did plan it, all of it." Margaret reached across the table to grasp Catherine's hand. "But why don't you remember? What happened between that day and your decision to become a mail-order bride?" Catherine closed her eyes, forcing herself to recall those dark months after Marcus's rejection. I think I convinced myself it was real. The story I'd created about being barren became the truth in my mind. It was easier to believe I was a victim of circumstances than to face what I'd actually done. The psychological defense mechanism was both brilliant and tragic. Unable to live with the knowledge that she'd deliberately sabotaged her engagement through deception, Catherine's mind had reconstructed the events to cast her as an innocent, a victim rather than the architect of her own downfall. "So I really can have children?" Catherine asked, though she almost dreaded the answer. Margaret nodded. "As far as I know, there's nothing preventing you from bearing children. The certificate I created was entirely fictional." The revelation should have brought joy, but instead Catherine felt overwhelmed by the complexity of her situation. She wasn't barren, but she'd built her entire relationship with Robert on the belief that she was. He'd married her partly because he thought she couldn't give him biological children, that she would therefore be content to mother the 3 orphans. Who needed them? How would he react to learning that she could bear him children of his own? Would he still value Tommy, Ben, and Mary as much if he could have biological heirs? The questions tormented her even as she recognized their unfairness. Robert had proven repeatedly that his love for the children wasn't conditional. "Margaret," Catherine said urgently, "Mrs. Whitmore's people are planning to bring you to Cedar Falls to testify against me. They want to destroy my family." Margaret's face hardened with resolve. "I know. They've offered me enough money to save my practice, to pay off my debts, to start over somewhere else." She paused, meeting Catherine's eyes directly. "But I've already made my decision. I'm not going to testify." Relief flooded through Catherine. "Thank you. You don't know what this means." "I'm not doing it for you," Margaret interrupted gently. "I'm doing it for those children you've taken in, and for the man who clearly loves you despite everything. But Catherine, my refusal to testify won't end this. Mrs. Whitmore will find other ways to attack your family." Catherine nodded, understanding that this victory was only temporary. "At least it gives us time to prepare, time to strengthen our position." "There's something else," Margaret said hesitantly. "Something that might help you understand Mrs. Whitmore's motivations." "What do you mean?" Margaret glanced around the cafe, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. "The man who contacted me about testifying mentioned that Mrs. Whitmore has personal reasons for wanting to separate those children from your family. Apparently she's been trying for years to establish a private orphanage in Colorado, one that would receive territorial funding but operate with minimal oversight. The pieces clicked into place in Catherine's mind. She needs orphaned children to make her facility profitable. Exactly. And 3 healthy, adoptable children in a high-profile case would demonstrate the need for her services while providing income through territorial payments. Margaret's expression grew grim. "Your family's happiness is standing in the way of her business venture." As Catherine prepared to return to Cedar Falls, armed with new understanding but facing greater challenges than ever, Margaret offered one final piece of advice. "Catherine, whatever you decide to tell your husband about your past, remember that the woman you've become is more important than the woman you were. The choices you've made since arriving in Wyoming, to love those children, to fight for your family, to build something real and good, those choices define you more than anything you did in desperation 3 years ago." The train journey home gave Catherine hours to consider Margaret's words and plan her next moves. She would tell Robert, the complete truth about her past, trusting in his love and understanding. She would prepare their family for Mrs. Whitmore's next assault, knowing that their enemies would not give up easily. Most importantly, she would embrace the possibility that she could give Robert biological children, while ensuring that Tommy, Ben, and Mary remained secure in their knowledge that they were loved and wanted. As the familiar landscape of the Wyoming Territory came into view, Catherine felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the people waiting for her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as the woman she had chosen to become, not the desperate person she had once been. The truth had been more complex and painful than she'd expected, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in 3 years, Catherine Walsh Harrison knew exactly who she was and what she was fighting for. Catherine returned from Denver to find her family under siege. Mrs. Whitmore had not waited for Margaret's testimony. Instead, she had accelerated her campaign, bringing new accusations and a team of territorial officials who had arrived that very morning to conduct what they termed an emergency welfare assessment. Robert met Catherine at the station, his face grim, with exhaustion and worry. "They've been here for 6 hours, he said without preamble, interviewing the children separately, examining every inch of the house, questioning our finances, our marriage, even our sleeping arrangements." Catherine felt fury rise in her chest. "Where are Tommy, Ben, and Mary now?" "In the house with Dr. Hartley." She arrived an hour after the officials and refused to leave, claiming she needed to monitor Mary's medical condition. Robert's expression softened slightly. "She's been our guardian angel, challenging every inappropriate question and documenting everything they do." As they drove toward the ranch, Robert filled Catherine in on the day's events. Mrs. Whitmore had arrived with 3 new officials, a territorial judge, a child welfare administrator, and most damaging of all, a woman who claimed to be a child psychology expert from back east. "They're not just looking for evidence of neglect anymore," Robert warned. "They're building a case that we're psychologically unfit to parent traumatized children." Dr. Kellerman, the psychology expert, spent 2 hours with each child, asking about nightmares, behavioral problems, attachment issues. Catherine's stomach clenched. What did the children tell them? The truth, as they always do. But this Dr. Kellerman seems skilled at twisting honest answers into evidence of problems. Robert's hands tightened on the reins. Tommy told her he sometimes dreams about the orphanage, so she wrote down persistent traumatic nightmares. Ben mentioned that he still checks the pantry every morning to make sure there's food, so she noted anxiety-based hoarding behaviors. Mary said she's afraid of being sent away, which became chronic abandonment anxiety. The manipulation infuriated Catherine. These were normal responses from children who had experienced genuine trauma. But in the hands of someone determined to find pathology, they became weapons against the family's stability. "Robert," Catherine said quietly, as the ranch came into view, "I need to tell you what I learned in Denver, about my past, about Margaret, about everything." She quickly summarized her conversation with Margaret, the recovered memories, the deliberate deception, the revelation about her fertility. Robert listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he surprised her completely. "I know," he said simply. Catherine stared at him. "You know? What do you mean, you know?" "I've known since the 2nd week of our marriage that something didn't add up about your medical history," Robert explained gently. "Little inconsistencies in your stories, reactions that didn't quite fit. But Catherine, I also saw how much you loved those children, how naturally you cared for Mary when she was sick, how you fought for all of us. Whatever you did 3 years ago, you did it as a different person in desperate circumstances." The unconditional acceptance in his voice nearly brought Catherine to tears. Aren't you angry, disappointed? I deceived you about something fundamental." Robert stopped the wagon and turned to face her fully. "Catherine, do you love me?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, "more than I ever thought possible." "Do you love Tommy, Ben, and Mary?" "With all my heart." "Then everything else is just history." He cupped her face gently in his weathered hands. "The woman who stepped off that train 2 months ago was exactly who our family needed, regardless of what brought her here." Their reunion was interrupted by the sight of an unfamiliar carriage parked in front of their house. Mrs. Whitmore had arrived for what Catherine suspected would be the final confrontation. Inside, they found chaos barely contained by Dr. Hartley's authoritative presence. 3 officials sat around the kitchen table with stacks of papers and notes, while Mrs. Whitmore paced the room like a predator claiming territory. Tommy, Ben, and Mary huddled together on the couch, their faces pale but defiant. "Ah, Mrs. Harrison," Mrs. Whitmore said with false sweetness as Catherine entered. "How convenient. We were just discussing the children's placement options." "These children already have a placement," Catherine replied evenly, "right here, with their legal guardians." Dr. Kellerman, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s, looked up from her notes. "Mrs. Harrison, based on my psychological evaluation, these children are displaying significant signs of unresolved trauma. They require specialized therapeutic intervention that cannot be provided in a home setting." "What kind of signs?" Dr. Hartley challenged from her position near the children. Dr. Kellerman consulted her papers with professional authority. "Thomas displays aggressive protective behaviors and resistance to authority figures. Benjamin shows anxiety-related food hoarding and hypervigilance. Mary exhibits separation anxiety and regressive attachment patterns." Catherine felt her teacher's instincts flare. "Dr. Kellerman, what you're describing as pathological behaviors sound like normal adaptive responses from children who have experienced institutional neglect. Tommy protects his siblings because no adult ever did. Ben worries about food because he's been hungry. Mary fears abandonment because she's been abandoned multiple times." "Mrs. Harrison," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted smoothly, "while your dedication to these children is admirable, you lack the professional training to assess their complex needs." "Perhaps," Catherine agreed, "but I have something more important. I love them." It was then that Tommy stood up from the couch, his young face set with a determination that reminded Catherine powerfully of Robert. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said in a voice that carried surprising authority for an 8-year-old, "can I ask you something?" Mrs. Whitmore looked taken aback but nodded. "Do you have children of your own?" The simple question seemed to throw the older woman off balance. "That's not relevant to—" "Do you?" Tommy pressed. "No, I do not," Mrs. Whitmore replied stiffly. Tommy nodded as if this confirmed something important. "Then how do you know what's best for us?" "Because Mama Catherine and Papa Robert do have children, us, and we know what makes us feel safe and loved and happy." Ben stood to join his brother. "The orphanage had doctors too, and officials who said they knew what was best for us. But they never asked us what we wanted. They never cared if we were scared or hungry or sick." Mary, not to be outdone by her brothers, climbed down from the couch and walked directly to Catherine, wrapping her small arms around Catherine's legs. "I want to stay with my mama," she announced clearly. "She takes care of me when I'm sick, and she reads me stories, and she makes me feel safe." The simple declarations from 3 children who had every reason to distrust adult promises seemed to affect even the hardened officials. Catherine noticed the territorial judge, a man who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, studying the family dynamics with new interest. "Children," Dr. Kellerman said with professional condescension, "you may not understand what's truly in your best interests." "We understand plenty," Tommy interrupted with heat. We understand that some adults use fancy words to hide that they don't really care about kids. We understand that you want to send us away to make money off us. And we understand that Mama Catherine and Papa Robert are the first adults who ever wanted us for real. The accusation about money-making hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, an unexpected voice joined the conversation. The boy's not wrong about the money. Everyone turned to see Margaret Thornfield standing in the doorway, travel-worn but resolute. Catherine's heart leapt with hope and confusion. Margaret was supposed to be in Denver, refusing to testify. "Dr. Thornfield," Mrs. Whitmore said with obvious surprise and displeasure, "I thought we had an arrangement." "We did," Margaret replied, coolly, entering the room with the confidence of someone who had made a difficult decision and found peace with it. "But I decided that some things are more important than money." She turned to address the room at large. "My name is Dr. Margaret Thornfield, and I'm here to provide testimony about this case, but not the testimony Mrs. Whitmore was expecting." Over the next hour, Margaret systematically dismantled Mrs. Whitmore's case. She testified that Catherine had never been her patient, that the medical certificate was fraudulent, but that Catherine's ability to bear children was irrelevant to her fitness as a mother. She provided documentation of Mrs. Whitmore's business, plans for a private orphanage, revealing the financial motivations behind the campaign to remove children from loving homes. Most damaging of all, she presented correspondence showing that Mrs. Whitmore had specifically targeted the Harrison family because their successful adoption threatened to set a precedent that would undermine her institutional model. "What Mrs. Whitmore wants," Margaret concluded, "is not what's best for these children, but what's most profitable for her proposed facility." The territorial judge, who had been taking notes throughout Margaret's testimony, finally spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore, these are serious allegations. Do you have a response?" Mrs. Whitmore's composure finally cracked. "Your Honor, Dr. Thornfield is clearly biased. She has personal connections to this family that compromise her objectivity." "Actually," the judge replied dryly, "her personal knowledge makes her testimony more credible, not less. She's admitted to creating fraudulent documentation, hardly something she'd do to help her cousin's case unless she was committed to telling the truth." He closed his notebook and stood, his decision clearly made. "I've seen enough. The emergency welfare assessment finds no evidence of abuse, neglect, or unfitness. These children will remain with their legal guardians, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison. Furthermore, I'm recommending a territorial investigation into Mrs. Whitmore's organization and methods." As the officials filed out, Mrs. Whitmore made one last attempt. "This isn't over," she hissed to Catherine. "I'll find other ways." "No, you won't," Robert said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "Because if you continue to harass my family, I'll make sure every newspaper in the territory knows exactly what you tried to do here." After the officials departed, the Harrison family found themselves alone with Margaret and Dr. Hartley. The relief was overwhelming, but Catherine knew they still had one more hurdle to cross. "Children," she said gently, "Dr. Thornfield has told us something important. It turns out that I may be able to have babies of my own after all." Tommy, Ben, and Mary exchanged glances, processing this information with the seriousness of children who had learned that adult situations were often complicated. "Does that mean you won't want us anymore?" Ben asked in a small voice. Catherine knelt down to their level, gathering all three children into her arms. "Listen to me carefully," she said firmly. "You are my children, not because I gave birth to you, but because I chose you and you chose me. If God blesses us with more children someday, they'll be your brothers and sisters, and you'll help me teach them how to be part of this family." "Promise," Mary whispered. "I promise," Catherine said solemnly, "forever and always." Robert joined them on the floor, wrapping his arms around the whole group. "We're a family," he said simply. Nothing and no one can change that. As winter gave way to spring, the Harrison Ranch flourished. The children thrived in their secure environment, growing stronger and more confident each day. Tommy proved to have a natural talent for working with horses. Ben discovered a passion for reading that led to dreams of becoming a teacher. And Mary blossomed into a healthy, happy child who rarely showed signs of her traumatic early years. Catherine found herself pregnant by late spring. But rather than changing the family dynamic, the news only strengthened their bonds. The children were ecstatic about becoming big brothers and sister, and Robert glowed with quiet pride at the prospect of expanding their family. On a warm June evening, as Catherine sat on the porch watching Robert teach the children to skip stones by the ranch pond, she reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. She had come west, as a broken woman fleeing a deception of her own making, believing herself unworthy of love and incapable of motherhood. What she had found was a truth more beautiful than any fiction, that families are built not by biology or circumstance, but by the daily choice to love each other through all of life's challenges and joys. The baby growing beneath her heart would be welcomed with the same fierce love that had embraced 3 orphaned children and transformed them all into something greater than they had ever been alone. A real family, chosen and cherished, strong enough to weather any storm that might come their way. As the sun set over the Wyoming territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine Walsh Harrison knew that sometimes the life you never planned turned out to be exactly the life you were meant to live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.